a wholly different type of question, and it's not answered in the same way. If I want to know tonight if Dr. de Sousa's arguments are rational, I don't crack his head open with a chisel and examine his brain to see if I can find rationality. I have to ask a different set of questions about the nature of his arguments. Likewise, the question of God and his being is not going to be answered by saying, well, I didn't see him behind Jupiter, or I can't see him as an orbiting teapot. That would be like saying, well, you know, being frustrated or irritated that when you were reading Shakespeare's Hamlet, that Shakespeare didn't fall out of the pages. If God is, if there is a God, and he's the creator and sustainer and governor of all things, which is the theistic assumption, then he is back of everything. And so my argument is essentially that God is a necessary precondition for the intelligibility of our experience. Without him, we're reduced to the absurd. Now, one of the most basic and foundational questions that we can begin to ask is, how do we know things at all? The British empiricist David Hume was skeptical about all knowledge. He didn't believe there was really evidence for the existence of an external material world, never mind the existence of God. He said that laws like the uniformity of nature are not observations, they're beliefs. But on what do we rest the belief that the future will be like the past? He said if future events that have not yet been experienced, we cannot pass judgment about the future, he says, based on simply our experience in the present. We see conjoined events, we see succession, but he says we don't see causality. We don't see the law of causality. In other words, he was skeptical about induction. Is it possible that tomorrow heat will move from cold to hot, not the other way round? How can we go from a particular observation to a more general conclusion? That's still a question, that's still an open question. I don't think Hume has yet been answered in his skepticism. Ernst Mach, who was a noted physicist in the last century, had a big following among scientists and philosophers, didn't believe that atoms existed because he was committed to an empiricist worldview. He said they're useful fictions, they help us describe our experience, but he didn't believe they had real existence. Well, along came a German philosopher called Kant, and he was deeply troubled by Hume's skepticism about knowledge, so he said, well, let's have a revolution here. Let's say that the mind actually structures reality for us. So we don't know reality as it really is, only as it appears to us. Only his views really collapsed into subjectivism and relativism because he was committed to Euclidean geometry and Newtonian physics and a very culturally specific set of conditions for trying to understand reality. So how can we know things? The mood of our time is existentialism. There is a weariness in thinking today, in our culture, in our world, especially in the Western world, about the possibility of knowledge at all. Jean-Paul Sartre, in the existentialist tradition, because of this, has said that we are a bubble on an ocean of nothingness. If we can't know anything beyond our senses, beyond biology and chemistry, how can we know anything at all? It's just matter in motion, it's just a world of flux. Well, I don't begin with the way that Hume does, with the autonomous individual, the thinking self. The foundation, I believe, for thinking is God himself. Either God is the source of all possibility or he's not. Is real knowledge possible? Now, I think that the philosophical tradition has shown that if you begin with the finite self, if you begin with yourself and say, I am going to be the ultimate criterion for truth, not God, all you end with is the self, your own mind. How can you really know anything more than that? We call this solipsism, solus and ipse, the mind alone, the self alone. How do you know that this debate tonight and everything around you is not just an expression or a representation of the self? Apart from professional rationalists, there are very few in the modern tradition who have not abandoned the idea of accurate description. We've gathered instead in little interpretative communities and said, well, we've got meanings here and you've got meanings there and there's other meanings here, but we can't really know anything. So my whole argument today is that God, if we're going to have an intelligible experience in this world, if we're to have a meaningful world, even to make sense of this debate tonight, has to be the source of explanation. Let me put it to you this way. I want to offer you an argument from a design plan. The non-theist holds that the world consists of a cosmic impersonalism. That is, there is no design plan, there's no preordained structure, there's no God who has revealed truth. Camus, the existentialist conclusion was therefore that we live in an absurd and meaningless world amidst a horde of irrationals. Why? Because in such a worldview, I believe in Dr. de Sousa's worldview, we are confronted with the brute fact. That is, chance. A parallel idea to the idea of the self, the independent I without God. You see, the non-theist does not permit that the universe, that you and I, are already structural in nature, that we already have essence as well as being, because of an eternal plan of God. So let's assume for a minute that the non-theist is right. Let's assume chance is ultimate. There's no design plan. There's no original structure. That means that you and I come to this world and come to experience this world, and as we think about our lives in this world, we must rationalize it for the first time in an original fashion. My mind must come to the world and rationalize the irrational. I must give it structure. I must rationalize it for myself. But of course, if that's true, then you might rationalize it in one way, Dr. de Sousa might rationalize it in another, I rationalize it in another, because I can't control the whole of reality. In other words, the existentialist tradition is right in saying that what comes to us is the non-rational. What's the given is the non-rational, and we just have to try and rationalize it for ourselves, because there is no pre-established pattern. Now, this is a faith, this is a belief system, this is a religious belief system. It's the idea that nature is by definition irrational because there's no original mind and organizing rational principle. This proves there's no neutrality in our approach to knowledge. The problem is if we are in a world of brute facts, of cosmic impersonalism, how can we have anything other than a brute, meaningless fact? When we eliminate God, we have just the I and brute factuality, an infinite number of unrelated, unknowable facts of experience. They're irrational, they're impervious to reason, they have no original relationship, they are isolated irrationals. So if I say, well, all the facts of the universe are like zeros, you can say, well, I've got 10 billion zeros, but at the end of it, what have you got? You've just got zero. Now you might say, well, we have being, but we define our own essence. Well, I hold that if the non-theist is consistent with what they profess to believe, in the end, nothing can be known, because if you can define your own essence, and you can define your own essence, and you can define your own essence, and I can define mine, then truth has disappeared out of the universe. And yet tonight I do believe that Dr. de Sousa will use and appeal to order and structure and law and rationality just to participate in this debate. You see, I hold that in the end, without God, the very idea of proof is absurd. You can't prove anything without God. He's the foundation of the possibility of proof. Einstein recognized this predicament when he argued that knowledge, if it starts and ends with experience, even though we've got logical concepts in our minds regarding reality, he says those concepts are abstract, they are empty. So he said this: how can it be that mathematics, being after all the product of human thought, which is independent of experience, is so admirably appropriate to the objects of reality? So he famously said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that the universe is comprehensible. How can we comprehend the universe unless there's a common creator for both our mind and this world that relates them together? Some have said, well, possibly out of the chaos just evolved various patterns in some naturalistic process. Of course, a law, even if you talk about laws in the universe, they are abstract entities, they're descriptions of what we observe, they're not powers, they're not agents. But even if you could have a universe out there without God, or a multiverse, how could it really ever be known? We are restricted to man-made conventions. So you can choose your faith tonight, you can choose your religious conviction. You've got, on the one hand, you're afloat in a vast ocean of chance, shoreless and bottomless, where none of us can know anything, or ourselves as we truly are, or we have